Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square, and I am so honored to be joined today by Gareth Gore, the author of Opus, which I have been crushing over the past week. It is so wildly engrossing. Gareth, first, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me on Sam. Greetings from London.
Yes. The Your name actually came up when I was speaking with Andrew Watkins uh, in an interview, and the chat went wild when your name came up, and clearly everyone in who was watching that show has read the book. But I would really love to introduce the book and Opus Dei specifically to more of our readers and viewers. So Opus Dei, I want to start with some background of the group, and then kind of get into how it's incorporated itself into the United States and our politics. And then there's some breaking news, believe it or not, about Opus Dei that we definitely need to cover. So I want to start with the book and with the foundations of Opus Dei. Now, the opening pages read like a financial thriller, and you're a financial reporter by trade, right?
Yep.
Um, this it it was very Da Vinci Code, except I found the Opus Dei to be somehow more dangerous, but also more ridiculous than the villains of Opus Dei. When did you realize this wasn't just a banking scandal, but a real political one?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Sam, I mean, I'm a financial reporter. I've been covering finance for the past 20 years. And I basically fell into this story by accident. What happened was a bank in Spain collapsed in 2017. And I was sent to report on the story. And at first, it kind of just seemed like every other bank collapse. And we've seen many of them, especially here in Europe, over the past 10,
Sure.
15 years. Um, and, I and almost everyone else, no, I and everyone else reported on that collapse in the same way, using that kind of same narrative of executives who'd taken too many risks, allowed things to get out of control, and then it all came crumbling down. So I wrote the story and kind of moved on, but there was something about it that just didn't seem right. And so basically over the next few years, and literally this became my hobby. Like after work, I'd come home and dig into like a new angle of the story.
You even moved to cover it, right?
Yeah, I mean, and so
It's a
I
little more than a hobby.
unpick things, and I discovered that this bank for about 60 years had been a cash machine for Opus Dei, that the group had infiltrated the bank in the 1950s. They'd basically taken over. They'd hijacked this bank. They'd used this compromise that they had on the old the old chairman of the bank, and used it to oust him. And then they turned it into their cash machine, and they funded the expansion of the group all over the world, including to the United States.
So,
Um,
so it wasn't the bank. It sounds like the thing that the smell test was that the bank failure just didn't seem like it shouldn't have failed, but something
well,
was happening
it wasn't
beneath the
like that.
surface.
So the bank had, the bank had taken too many risks, and I think the failure had been expected for some time.
Hmm.
Um, but what was different was that was the aftermath of the collapse. So normally when these things collapse, you then see this scramble afterwards of all the bondholders and shareholders who launch all of these legal cases and trying to get their money back. And so part of what interested me was that a couple of years on, many of the shareholders and bondholders were trying to, they were going through that process of getting their money back. And as I was investigating, they were very happy to talk to me. They wanted a bit of publicity for the, for their cases. But what piqued my interest most of all was the fact that the biggest shareholder of all, this kind of mysterious entity which called itself the syndicate, just disappeared from the scene, and it was impossible to talk to them. And so as a journalist, if the one thing that really draws your attention is when people don't want to talk, and
Right.
so that's what kind of dragged me in. And I started to look into what this group was. And it turned out that it was almost like a stack of Russian dolls. Like, so there was this syndicate, the kind of overarching entity, and then within it there were all these little companies which had really quite, I guess, benign sounding names and very vague sounding names.
Right.
But as you looked into each of them, and put them and kind of stacked them up beside each other, there were all of these remarkable similarities. They shared like the same shareholders, the same directors. They were all registered to the same address, and critically, which is kind of what got me onto Opus Dei, they were all funneling money from the bank to Opus Dei initiatives around the world.
Right, through sweetheart loans and yeah, and risky loans and mysterious financial instruments, and yeah, it's that from that nugget it expands into, you sort of work backwards. And so I do want to talk about the founding and Jose Maria Escriva. He without going too much into him, this Opus Dei was his sort of fever dream, and he sounds, the way you've described him, as a bit of a privileged young man who liked really nice things, but who also had a lot of emotional turmoil. He aligned himself with Franco very early on. So this began as a pretty extreme right-wing conservative organization. How did that, how did he go from being, a part of that right-wing extremist situation in Spain to a more global hegemonic organization?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. So this organization grew up in the years before the Spanish Civil War, when the country was deeply divided between left and right, and he saw what was happening around him, and he very quickly decided that Opus Dei would be a vehicle. He called his followers. He said that they were part of a rising militia who would rise up and kind of enter into battle against the enemies of Christ. Now, in his mind, the enemies of Christ were basically anyone who was progressive. He'd lived through this very tumultuous period where people were turning their backs on the church. They were demanding new rights for themselves and beginning to question the hold that the church had had over Spanish society. And so he saw Opus Dei as fighting back. So the Civil War, of course, was won by Franco, and in the first years after the Civil War, Opus Dei exploded. He really got into bed with Franco, and they were very complimentary about each other. And once the organization started to take off in Spain, he very quickly began to cast his eye elsewhere. First of all, he expanded into Portugal, and then they made a trip to the Vatican to ask the Pope for permission to expand to other countries, and the Pope granted this permission. And by the late 40s, he was already expanding into Latin America and sending out a kind of reconnaissance team to the States to scope out where would be good to set up in the States. Eventually they would set up in Chicago and then branch out into Boston. But he saw himself as something of a savior for Christendom, and I think that kind of mentality has continued today and is extremely kind of pertinent for many of the Opus Dei followers, especially in the United States today, who see themselves as part of this, this hidden militia who are once again entering into battle against the progressives.
And I and I think that sort of framing, that language of the militia going into battle against their enemies of Christ, which simply means people who disagree with them about anything, right? It has a lot of resonance to what's happening today in the United States. But I want to kind of circle back around to get a little more specific on what happens in Opus Dei, because this isn't just about political or economic or even religious power. It's about, this is a story of abuse and coercion and very personal and deep control. And this is where, Escriva himself seemed kind of clownish in some ways in the book, you know, and it's and the things that they did were kind of absurd. And for sure, you know, some of his you know, chief lieutenants in the you know, 50s and 60s were just lavishing themselves with, you know, with all of the finer things and palaces and you know, one reason they needed the bank in the first place was because he was spending so much money building and building and building, and yet the people that he recruited, he had absolute and total domination over. Can you explain basically what happens in Opus Dei on a
Yeah.
day-to-day?
So absolutely. I mean, so yes, the founder, this Spanish priest called Jose Maria Escrivá, who's now, by the way, a saint in the Catholic
Which
Church.
I haven't gotten to that part in the book, and I'm like, wait, what? How
Yes.
did this happen?
Well, he was absolutely clownish, but also at the same time, this evil genius. So in the 1930s, when they were just kind of getting, you know, their feet off the ground, he basically wrote down this playbook for recruitment. So he was determined, he knew that to have any kind of impact, what they needed to do was infiltrate the corridors of power. And so they needed to recruit from the elite. And so he set out all of these methods in writing about how Opus Dei should go about recruiting people. Unlike the rest of the church, which is open to anyone that knocks on its door and wants to be a practicing Catholic, in Opus Dei it's by invitation only. And that's because they only want people who will be useful to the organization. So once they draw you in, you know, there are different kinds of membership. So there's the kind of the core membership, which are these celibate members called numeries who live in Opus Dei lodges, single sex Opus Dei lodges, and they are expected to, you know, they dedicate every part of their life to Opus Dei. They're completely obedient. They take these kind of almost these semi vows of poverty and chastity, and they're required to do whatever the director who runs the local center asks of them. And so, you know, they follow this kind of strict timetable through the day of prayer and meditation, and they're expected to go out and recruit as many people as possible. They're constantly kind of asked, so how many people have you recruited today, and who's on the cusp of joining? And it's this kind of this pressure cooker of recruitment, kind of with this veil of spirituality placed around it. And this, you know, and these ranks, these numery ranks, are riddled with abuse and control. You know, the any connections with the outside world are controlled. They're often, you know, at the drop of a hat, they're told, right, you need to quit your job and you're going to move to this other city because we need you there. They're cut off from their friends and family. They're expected to perform these rituals of mortification. So they wear this barbed kind of wire around their thigh for a couple of hours a day called a cilis. They whip themselves once a week, and some of them kind of draw blood by whipping themselves. It's all, you know, and so yeah, I mean, and you know, over the years there have been numerous allegations of, you know, really serious abuse, psychological, emotional, even physical abuse that have come from former members. Many members have talked about how, you know, there's this epidemic of mental illness inside Opus Dei, that were, you know, the organization organizes for, it sends you know, it sends these sick members to Opus Dei doctors to be prescribed medications so that they can cover up the
Right.
illness. I mean, it's absolutely horrific inside.
So you know, I'm trying. There's like so many things I want to go. I want to cover, but I know we have limited time. But one really fascinating thing to me about that was many of the numeraries from the beginning, Escriva understood that he needed money, and one way to do it was to incorporate his people into the broader and mainstream world. And that to me feels like a sort of secret sauce of Opus Dei. This idea that, you know, if you walk down the street in New York City and you see the Jehovah's Witnesses or you know, any sect really of, you know, evangelical, like
Mhm.
you've got robes, you've got hats, you've got the thing. These people were bankers. They were business people. They owned businesses, and during the day they went and did their job, and then at night they would come back and live in this crazy dorm with a whole bunch of other men, and also give their entire paycheck to Opus Dei. Um, there were other, and I want to talk about the other members of Opus Dei who were not men, the women, and then I want to get into the United States and Leonard Leo and the Catholic Information Center. But the men weren't the only ones who were in an abusive relationship with this situation. The women who served them were really trafficked. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to be clear, you have these elite members, the numeraries, who are, as you say, bankers, lawyers, politicians, and they go out during the day, they do their jobs, and they come back at night to the lodge, and they hand over their paychecks. They become completely dependent upon the organization. But they also have this life outside where they're doing God's work, as they're told. They're pushing the kind of Opus Dei agenda. They're both men and women, so you get men and women doing that kind of thing. But then, in addition to that, there's this kind of underclass of members who are called they were originally called the numerary servants before Opus Dei. Maybe they kind of perhaps realized that wasn't a great branding exercise, and so they renamed them to be numerary assistants. And these were and are young girls who were recruited from kind of underprivileged neighborhoods and communities. Initially, they would recruit them locally. So in Spain or the US, they'd recruit these girls locally. Often they promise them a better education. Come and join the local school. We'll teach you how to cook, and we'll teach you how to do this and that. It's a path to a much better life. But then once they kind of move to these schools, they're indoctrinated, they're coerced into joining Opus Dei, and eventually they become these servant girls who work for free for the organization. So initially that happened kind of locally, but I guess over the years, as women in Spain and across Europe and in the United States have quite rightly aspired to be better, more than just a maid, although there's nothing, of course, wrong with being a maid, Opus Dei began to set up these schools in third world, and using money from the bank again. So the bank, funded the construction of these schools in places like Argentina, Kenya, the Philippines, Nigeria, and it was aimed at recruiting again. And these girls are, sometimes as young as 12, 13 when they're being recruited, and they're committing themselves to a life of servitude, serving the elite members of Opus Dei, so that they can have more time to go out and recruit, the rich and the powerful, so they can really, push forward the Opus Dei agenda.
Well, speaking of the rich and powerful and Opus Dei agenda, I want to recenter on Washington. You write extensively about the Catholic Information Center, which you call the closest tabernacle to the White House.
Sorry, I don't call it that. There's a blue plaque inside the Opus Dei Center in
They call it that.
Bay Street. There's a blue plaque where they literally say those words.
Oh my God. I mean, okay, so tell us about the Catholic Information Center.
So the Catholic Information Center is, I guess, the beating hub of Opus Dei in central Washington, D.C. So Opus Dei has a presence in almost 70 countries around the world, and it generally focuses its presence in big cities, and especially in political cities like D.C. In the DC area, Opus Dei has about 3,000 members, and they're generally kind of from the political and kind of judicial classes. They're people who can have some kind of influence. I mean, when you look at people who are affiliated to Opus Dei, it just absolutely blows the mind.
Yeah,
this is the absolute elite of generally the Republic, almost exclusively the Republican Catholic elite, and people like Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation. He's a regular at the Opus Dei Center in central DC. He goes there for what's called spiritual direction, where the Opus Dei priest tells him kind of basically what he should be doing, what's good, what God wants. You have people like Leonard Leo, who is the guy who almost single-handedly orchestrated the conservative Catholic takeover of the US Supreme Court. And, you know, like sitting on the board of this Opus Dei Center in the middle of DC are other people like, you know, Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, Mick Mulvaney, the former White House budget czar, the Pat Cipollone, you know, Trump's first the White House lawyer. This is the absolute creme de la creme of the American political Republican elite. And it's by design, right? You know, as I was saying before, as a normal Catholic, you can't just knock on the door of Opus Dei and say, "Hey guys, I kind of like what you do. Can I join?" They decide who they want to join, and they very specifically target the elite. And so it's no accident that they're now, you know, they have all of this influence in DC, and they can, you know, try to push their agenda.
Right. And I mean, even, you know, former Attorney General Bill Barr has, you know, framed modern politics as a spiritual battle against secularism, which absolutely mirrors what you were saying earlier about Opus Dei. This is an absolute battle. You know, I wonder about the coordination of that worldview. This I have trouble getting my head around whether this is about um, religious purity or about economic and political power, or both. How do those factors intermingle?
I think in my mind, this is a political project and has been since the start. I mean, for the past 100 years, Opus Dei has basically hidden the writings of its founder from its members and from the wider world, and even from the Vatican. Now, luckily, thanks to some whistleblowers, I managed to get my hands on them, and I reproduce many sections in the book. And it's quite clear that, you know, this was a political project right from the start. But what it is, it's a political project that uses this kind of veil of spirituality, one, to lure in unsuspecting victims. These are, you know, people who join Opus Dei are generally good Catholics who really just want to kind of delve deeper into their faith. They want to be more serious about, you know, the devotion to God and being a good Catholic. And they fall into this abusive system where they're used as pawns to push this political agenda. So I think, you know, whilst Opus Dei calls itself a religious organization, a spiritual organization, it isn't. It's a political organization that uses spirituality, which abuses spirituality to push forward its agenda, I think.
And I think, you know, this is we're seeing this happen in real time here, this transformation. And I think that what the book does so well is dispel this sort of mysticism around this group. It is a shadowy cabal of wealthy and powerful people, but they're also ridiculous. And and not to dismiss the danger that they pose, but, you know, Peter Thiel talking about the Antichrist and U.S. destruction, and
Well,
is he a believer, or is he a powerful, or has he just lost the plot altogether?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Peter Thiel, because Peter Thiel was very close to an Opus Dei priest whilst he was at Stanford.
Hmm.
And this Opus Dei priest happened to be one of the most senior Opus Dei people in the whole of the United States.
Wow.
A guy called Arnie Panula, who later moved to Washington and really kind of headed up the recruitment of many of the political elites there. And he and Thiel used to go on these walks around Stanford where they would bemoan the fact that how since the 1970s, I guess technological development and advances in society have basically halted. And, you know, I'm not sure whether I completely buy that argument or not, but I mean, but certainly the Opus Dei's kind of interpretation of that was that was when Roe v. Wade came in 1973.
Right.
And so it's kind of, you know, it's bringing and that's what's happening so much these days. We have all of these complex societal, economic issues that require us to sit down and try and figure out a way ahead that works for people and is respectful towards people. But instead, things are kind of shoehorned into this religious narrative where things are black or white, good or bad. and there's no, it's kind of it becomes this kind of a pure kind of blind culture where you're just and I think that's kind of what's happening. It's a way of, the way that religion has been, I guess, used by many politicians recently, is a way to avoid having these complex debates and conversations, and just, painting something as good or bad.
Sure.
We no longer need to have the talk anymore.
Yeah, you have a shorthand for
Yes.
uh, for a policy or for an entire cultural stance, and it seems to me that what we've been talking about this whole time is a cult, really.
I mean, I used that word on the front of the book, and I did not use the word lightly. I thought long and hard before I used that word. But absolutely, the way that Opus Dei operates is, it's a cult, and it's a cult that is is based on the idolatry. And again, that's not a word I use lightly. Catholics, for Catholics, that's a very strong word. But it's an organization that idolizes its leader and everything he says and wrote down, and it's not healthy, and it's created this abusive system which perpetuates to this day.
Yeah, and I we talk, Andrew Watkins and I, and we here at Lincoln Square have been talking about white Christian nationalists a lot, both on the Catholic and the Protestant side, which maybe we should have another conversation about the internecine war between those two, but that's for another time. It does feel like the ultimate end game for them is to have a cult, have a very wealthy cult, lead the cult, and then make everyone else join the cult, whether or not they want to join the particular cult. It seems like that's the project of governance in America right now, and everyone should be rather terrified about it.
Yeah, I'm not even sure they want everyone to join the cult. They just want the cult to gain enough power and influence to
Hmm.
push the kinds of changes that they want, so that everyone has to lead the lives that they, according to the kind of warped worldview. And you don't have to join, you're just going to have to suck it up and live the way that we tell you to live.
Right, right. Yeah, it's I reckon everyone needs to read the book. But also, and we have a couple of minutes left. I want to talk about sorry, not that one, this one, what you dropped today as I was preparing for this interview. There's breaking news out of the Vatican, and the Vatican has had a really tumultuous relationship with Opus Dei since the beginning. Or I should say, Opus Dei has had a tumultuous relationship with the Vatican. Pope Francis was not a fan, as I understand, and had taken actions to limit their scope and power and all of this. And it seems now like we're getting a clearer picture of what Pope Leo is thinking about doing. I know you only have a minute, but if you could top line this, and then everyone, you have to read the article on Substack and then the book, and you'll be read in.
So, I mean, the Vatican has been struggling for many years with the question about, what to do about Opus Dei. They've known for years that this is an abusive cult, um, but it's been difficult because they have a huge following. They have almost 100,000 members around the world, and many of those members are very wealthy and in positions of power and influence. Not the kinds of Catholics that you want to upset. And
Right.
so, Pope Francis made his first move against the group 3 years ago, and since then there have been all these kind of tentative steps to really kind of forcing them to reform. It looks like we're now on the cusp of hearing exactly what's going to happen. And on the face of it, to kind of sum up, it looks like Leo is kind of headed in the right direction. He's addressing some of the more serious points of abuse, control, but he's not gone far enough. Myself and former members have been knocking on the door of the Vatican saying, please let us explain to you why this group is dangerous, how it works, so that you can better reform this group. And we've been completely ignored. I think, perhaps the Pope, to give him to be kind to him, maybe doesn't want to be seen to be taking sides, but at the same time, I think the Vatican doesn't get how this group operates. So what I fear is that whilst these reforms come from the right place and have the right kind of intentions, I fear they're going to fail, and that they're just going to drive Opus Dei underground. It's going to continue to
Right.
do what it does, and yeah, I think I'm not too hopeful.
Well, I think, to end it there, I think the, Opus Dei and Escriva himself operated with or without the blessing of the Vatican the entire time. And so there's no reason to think that that will not continue. And you can disband Opus Dei, but you can't disband Leonard Leo,
Yes.
or Peter Thiel. They still exist, and they still have these beliefs, and they understand the funneling of power upward better than anyone.
And the bottom line is, this is a cult, and the members of this cult believe that the leader, actually kind of had this vision delivered to him directly from God. And so who's the Pope to step in and say that they can no longer do that? I mean, that's kind of basically the essence of this.
Who's the Pope? Who's the Pope indeed? Well, Gareth Gore, I really appreciate you stopping by. And this is the book. Make sure you go out and pick it up right away. It is so engrossing for a financial religious thriller. It is really something else, and it says a lot about where we are at the current moment. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.